to this new event for the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre at London Metropolitan University. We are so pleased today to have you all there. Many apologies for sending sending the wrong link. We don't know how this happened. Now I can see it sorted out. So that's great to have you there. Before I pass to Gordana and Professor Shunisha, just let me remind you that this is an event for the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, that we've got a wonderful website, very much updated, and we'll finish updating that for Christmas, with new events coming up next year. In January. Just remember, you need to register on them to receive updates and the right links, etc. So this is the last event we've got before Christmas. So I pass that to Gordana and Sinisha, for they will be leading this guest lecture. Gordana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much, all of you who managed to join us. I guess we know definitely that you want to be here, since you put a lot of effort to join us at this moment.
Sorry, Gordana, there is an echo. Can everybody turn off their microphones? Everybody, turn off their microphones. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. So again, welcome. As I said, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Sinisha Maleshevich. She is a professor of sociology at University College Dublin. He is also a member of Royal Irish Academy, the Academy of Europe, and an associate member of the Academy of Sciences and Arts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Sinisha's main research interests include the study of war and organized violence, ethnicity, nation-states and nationalism, ideology, sociological theory, and comparative historical sociology. Among many of his publications, let me emphasize his last few books. One is called Grounded Nationalisms, a sociological analysis, which was a runner-up and honorable mention of 2020 Spain Roken Award, and his The Rise of Organized Brutality, a historical sociology of violence, that received Outstanding Book Award from the American Sociological Association in 2017. Sinisha will speak about nationalism and cultural diversity. We're going to have his talk about 30 minutes, and then we will have lots of time to discuss the topic. However, I would really appreciate if you could reserve your comments and your questions at the end of this session, of the speech, mostly because I could easily miss it, and to be honest, I could easily forget those questions. So we will have plenty of time for that. And now I will just leave everything for Sinisha. Yeah, we are muting them right now. Sinisha, it's all yours.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much, Goga, for inviting me and for organizing this event in the first place. I'm sorry that we had this technical hiccup, but that's the nature of online interaction. So it's inevitable, these things do happen. So today I'll talk a little bit about nationalism in general and the relationship between nationalism and cultural diversity from a kind of historical sociology point of view. And we can start. I have some slides here, which I hope you will be able to see. Does everybody see? This is okay? Okay, great. So nationalism is often perceived as a thing of the past, as something that belongs firmly to the past. And we often hear things like relic of the 19th century. The heyday of nationalism was firmly in the past, in the 19th century. What I want to argue is that this is a very wrong way to look at nationalism, that this in itself is a nationalist narrative of nationalism, in a sense, which is built around that idea that, you know, sometime in the 19th century, people have risen against monarchies or feudal order or imperial powers, and then suddenly they overthrew this prison of nations and created these nation states, and since then everything is more or less stable. And if you look at the kind of this image, these two images from the recently published from The Economist and the Foreign Affairs, 2016, when Trump was elected, they always project nationalism in this light. You know, it is something to do with the past, and as you can see here, Trump and Putin and Farage and Marine Le Pen in the background. If you look at the Economist image, they are very much depicted as people coming from a different century, late 18th or early 19th century. They're dressed up in these clothes that resemble that time. They have flags, aggressively waving flags, and they play war drums. So this is the kind of the conventional image of nationalism. It's something to do with radicalism, with violence. The same thing we see with the foreign affairs, the clenched fists, and it's particularly something to do with the past. So often when nationalism is perceived in the media, it is made visible, it's associated with some kind of exception, excess, something that is out of the ordinary, something that interrupts everyday life. And it is, once we address this problem, once we deal with this far-right excess, everything will go back to normal. And today we are still kind of have these discourses very much present. Once we get rid of Trump or whatever, everything will go back to normal. So what I want to argue is this is not, what nationalism is. This is just a tiny version element. This is just a radicalized version of nationalism. Nationalism is not something that just appears as a far-right, a radical nativist, populist a phenomenon. It's a much deeper and historically much more embedded phenomenon. And this is very much linked and important for us in the context of this topic of cultural diversity, because we are quite aware that far right is an enemy of diversity. They openly say that they don't like any kind of diversity, religious, linguistic, ethnic, cultural, but we don't really see that all nationalisms have elements of that very much. So if you look a little bit at all this debate that has been present recently about new nationalism, it is a term that has been used and popularized over the last 3 or 4 years. And the assumption is this is again, new phenomenon, that hasn't happened before. But what I want to try, and if you look at the kind of titles of these books, and this is a tiny, there are hundreds of titles of books on new nationalism. What we see here is that this is a concept that starts already from kind of 100 years ago. It was the Roosevelt, the first book here, the Roosevelt, American president, who used the term new nationalism in 1910. He gave a series of speeches in the American context. And since then, a lot of scholars, a lot of analysts have used this idea of new nationalism, throughout the world and for different time periods. So if you look at the second book here, the new nationalism, the First World War, the concept was used to explain why First World War started. And then you see, for example, the New Nationalism by Louis Snyder book from 1960. Concept is used to explain what was happening in Quebecois province in Canada and in Catalonia and Scotland in the 60s. Then we have the Blood and Belonging. You don't see the subtitle, is the Journeys in the New Nationalism, which is used to explain collapse of Soviet Union and the kind of rise of far-right discourses and nationalisms and wars throughout Eastern Europe. We also have the breakup of Britain, Crisis of the New Nationalism, famous Tom Nair's book on British nationalism written in the 70s. And then we have lots of books in the 80s and 90s using the same concepts. So in all of these things, we have this kind of idea that nationalism, suddenly appears, and it really is an indicator of analysts and scholars' own surprise that nationalism didn't go away, because it was meant to be this 19th century relic that once, we dealt with it in the 19th century, now it's meant to leave. But this hasn't happened in the last 120 years. and it's not really going to happen in the near future either. We have attempts to deal with these kind of explanations, why is nationalism still with us, why it's powerful, why suddenly raises this so-called ugly head. And more recent explanations have tended to focus either on the cultural reasons for this. So we have the so-called cultural backlash thesis, articulated particularly by Englehart and Norris, which focuses more on the kind of how people shift politically from center-right to far-right because they see immigration or perceive that immigration is an issue, or that there are some demographic changes taking place. But it's all about framing these things. So the idea, this is all really a cultural understanding. It's a clash of different perspectives, identities, and things like that. Then we have economic interpretations of this phenomenon, which focus more on the kind of economic inequalities, the unregulated capitalism, the kind of neoliberal consequences of neoliberalism of the last few decades, weakening of the state power, and these are seen as kind of driving forces of so-called new nationalism. So what I want to argue here is that this is really not enough for us to understand the long-term impact of nationalism, the strength of nationalism that has been taking place for the last 250 years. So we need a kind of longue durée type of analysis to understand this dynamic. The economic factors, cultural factors, and other factors certainly do play part, but they are not enough because the focus has to be on much long-term changes. So if you look at the world today, we have this is really the accurate type of image to capture the world in which we live. And this, the world that is very much border defined, it's the world of nation states, which are represented in this particular map with their flags. And this is really a world that we inhabit today. And this is a world that has been developing as such for a number of years now. So my point really is that we have to look at the way how nationalism gradually became dominant operative ideology of modernity, and how it has become much more grounded, much more embedded in everyday lives, in organizations, key organizations that dominate this world, in ideological discourses that dominate around us. So in a sense, there is no sudden and unexpected rise of nationalism. Nationalism is not some sort of a temporary aberration. It's not some sort of ideological anomaly that occasionally interrupts natural flow of social development. It is a hegemonic form of political legitimacy in the world in which we live. So it is a principal mode of collective subjectivity in the modern world. And the point is for us to understand why is this so, and to trace this development historically. So to do so, we first of all need to define what nationalism is. And I see nationalism as an ideology that posits the nation as a principal unit of human solidarity and political legitimacy. So that's a kind of the simplest understanding of nationalism. But obviously, nationalism is much more than that. It's a meta-ideology. It is also a way how we see the world, how we experience the world, how we kind of understand people around us, how we define them. And in the world in which we live, nationalism has become almost second nature because we do kind of assume that everybody is born in some nation. You can have obviously more than one passport, or you can switch nationalities, but saying that I have no nation is not an option in the world in which we live. So we need to understand why is this so? Why did nationhood as an everyday practice, as a way of conceptualizing, categorizing the world around us, has become second nature? And this has something to do with the character of the states in where we live. These are the nation states. And it's very important for us to understand that, this ideological understanding of the world that we have, which is shaped by the whole idea of nationhood, is grounded in the organizational dominance of a nation state. Before nation state, we had empires, and we had patrimonial kingdoms, and we had city-states, and all sorts of other forms of territorial organization. More recently, nation state has become a dominant, the only legitimate form of political authority in the world. Today, nobody will claim, to be an empire, although we use the term empire to describe big, powerful states, such as US or Russia or China, or even EU for some. but this is used in a negative terms, in a kind of derogatory terms. Before, in the 19th century and the 18th century and before, empire had a very positive image. So in that sense, we live in a world where all these other forms of political authority are largely delegitimized, and nation state is understood as being the only legitimate and optimal form of state organization. And ideology that justifies the existence of nation state, the legitimized existence of nation state, is nationalism. So that's the main issue. This link between the state, character of the state, and the ideology that underpins that state is crucial. We cannot break that link. So in that sense, nationalism is very much linked to the character of the state. And if you look historically, if we, the way how human beings have lived on this planet, we have lived in all sorts of other types of social orders. As I said, as hunter-gatherers for about 99% of our existence, even before we became humans for about 200,000 years. And then once human beings have settled, that's in the last 10 to 12,000 years, empire has been the dominant form of socialization for at least 5,000 years. And then all these other forms that I mentioned, city-states and patrimonial kingdoms and sultanates and khanates and everything else. And the nation state really counts for less than 2% of existence of us as human beings on the planet, and even less than 2% if we count this as a global phenomenon, once the nation state became global institution. So why has nation state become so prevalent, so powerful, so established? And there are many obviously explanations. We don't have time to go into detail. One of the reasons for that is obviously the historical contingencies of regime collapse in France, and in the context of the French Revolution, the colonial defeat in the US by the British Empire, and the consequence of this were the French-American revolutions, also the Latin American wars of independence in the context of weakening and collapsing Spanish and Portuguese empires. So in the 19th century, which is, as I said in the beginning, often seen as this heyday of nationalism, we were really in the world of empires. So if you look at this image, these are the most powerful states of the 19th century and early 20th century, and they are all empires, British and French, Spanish and Portuguese, although much weakened empire, but still empire nonetheless, Austro-Hungarians, Imperial Russia, Italian small empire, Ethiopia and Libya and everything else, German Empire, Dutch Empire, Belgian Empire, Ottoman Empire. So in a sense, 19th century was very much still world dominated by empires. Although we did, obviously, with the French Revolution, with the American Revolution, had beginnings of the nationalization processes. This was still world of imperial power. So what's important for us to look at is how gradually nation states have replaced empires, and by the end of the Second War, and particularly from 1960s, when the empires are definitely, with the decolonization, have become delegitimized, the nation state become the ultimate and only form of power. Until that period, we see kind of transitional states, if you like. We see elements of imperial and national states that are nationalizing often at home, like France and Britain, while imperializing still abroad, expanding further. That's particularly the case with overseas empires. And we often see also how some states, like France, were republics, national republics, and then become empires during the Napoleon, and then they revert again to the nation state form, and so on. And we have other examples like Maximilian I of Mexico did the same, and Pedro I of Brazil, and everything else. So if you look at this other map here, what is interesting here, these are the two prototypical examples often invoked when we talk about nationalism. 19th century Italy, 19th century Germany. So, in a conventional historiography, there is always that emphasis, this is a belated unification of Germany, Italy, where people have, somehow decided that they belong together and created these political states of Germany and Italy. But in reality, these were imperial projects. In a German case, if you look at the blue, this is all Prussia, expanding dramatically and really capturing the rest of what would become, Germany, with lots of resistance. We know lots of research now points out in Wittenberg and in Bavaria, there was a lot of resistance to that. The whole idea was understood what it was. It was an imperial project. And Bismarck was very much against the idea of nation, didn't want to incorporate Austria, for example. So language wasn't particularly important as it never was for an imperial project. Similar things we find in Italian case with the Piedmont, as often seen as a kind of unifying the state, but Italian state, but actually expanding itself, and trying to create another imperial project. So these were not, nation states yet. These were still imperial projects, and they were gradually becoming nationalizing state only after unification. So in that sense, nationalism is really much more of a 20th century phenomenon, 21st century phenomenon than 19th century phenomenon. Okay, so if we focus a little bit more now on the issue of diversity, because that's at the heart of this relationship, how nationalism replaces other political orders and other forms of ideology. So, as we know from Michael Mann and Charles Tilly and other historical sociologists, war played an important part in this process, preparation, mobilization for war, intensification of European warfare over the last 200 years, in particular, led to more centralized authority, led to more constitutional type of order, also the development of infrastructural capacities of states such as transport and communication. All of these things were preconditions, organizational preconditions for transformation from an imperial in the direction of national order, if you like. But what's also important for us is this other element, and that's the question of cultural diversity. So from the early on, what we see in these kind of nationalizing movements in France, after the French Revolution, after the American Revolution, we see kind of this emphasis on creating cultural homogeneity, destroying diversity, if you like, in the process. And the famous pamphlet, published in the context of the French Revolution by Abbé Grégory, has a title which is very it describes exactly what the aim is, the report on the necessity and means to annihilate the patois, the minority languages, and universalize the French language. And this is a map of France just, at the time of the revolution. And what you see enormous linguistic diversity, and you see other forms of diversity present here. And the map doesn't really capture the tiny micro world of diversity, which was enormous. So in a sense, what we see here in the French Revolution is an attempt to create this kind of nation state at the expense of cultural diversity, by killing off cultural diversity. In that context, nationalism was very much a project that was an enemy of diversity from the very beginning. And nation state has developed along these lines to attain this hegemonic position that it has today, particularly after as I said, after the Second World War, when the nation-state model has become, universal model for the whole world, and it has become unquestioned. So once the nation-state principle of territorial organization became dominant, it expanded fairly quickly, both internally within specific societies and externally throughout the globe. And internally, what it means essentially penetrating different social strata. Nationalism started off as a middle-class phenomenon, upper middle-class phenomenon, led by intellectuals and kind of cultural elites, and then political elites, economic elites, and then gradually incorporated many other groups, workers and later peasants or farmers who, in a famous, Eugene Weber's formulation, peasants became Frenchmen. So this was a largely a coercive process that tried to kill any form of cultural difference as it was possible in that sense. So we can say that nationalism developed as a historical phenomenon through, I call that, through grounding, organizational grounding, ideological grounding, and micro-interactional grounding. Organizational grounding is about developing organizational capacity to do this, so like transport and communication networks that developed throughout France and connected the different parts of France together. Ideological grounding is about imposing particular educational system and increasing literacy rates in a particular discourse. This is a point made by Gellner and Anderson and others as being kind of crucial in homogenizing population. And a lot of this was very coercive, very much an attack on cultural difference. And then we have the micro-interactional grounding, which is everyday kind of a context through which human beings understand the world in the face-to-face interaction. You know, we absorb these categories of nationhood and reproduce them themselves. So it's this everyday form of nationalism. So since nationalism privileges nation and nationhood as the kind of the dominant form of solidarity, it has been an enemy of diversity from the very beginning. So it's not only far right, not only some sort of extreme groups, it is the mainstream. The mainstream was really an enemy of the diversity. So if you look at the kind of what was happening throughout the 19th and early 20th century, we see throughout Europe, North America, and also the rest of the world, how gradually local solidarities, regional identities, kinship-based differences were all homogenized, coercively homogenized, in part through educational system imposing kind of uniform compulsory education system on everybody, primary school, secondary school, teaching these subjects that are now universal, like national history, national languages, and things like that, which in itself is an invention of the French Third Republic. Conscript armies played an important, obviously, a process in bringing kind of ordinary people from all over the country into this school of the nation that army became. Policing was also important of behavior, when court systems forced people to act in a particular way, to think of themselves along the national terms. Various institutions of public shaming played an important part. So state was crucial in nationalizing populations, in destroying cultural diversity. Civil society also was very important in that process. Mass media, private mass media played a really important role in nationalizing population. We can think only, let's say, in the British context of the Second Boer War and the whole invention of jingoism. It's a product of private media, private mass media, which combine imperial and national ideologies together, and develop this notion of jingoism, which is still present in many ways in British media, I can see. Public sphere as well, the importance of different civil society groups, nationalist societies promoting this and that, their influence on the state and all of that. So all of these things were very important, were kind of played an important part in kind of defining and understanding, the process of nationalization. And if you look at in the French Revolution, both French and American Revolution have defined themselves in these kind of universalist terms. It is about declaration of protection of rights of man and citizen. But what it was meant by that is really giving up on your cultural diversity. You could become a French equal with other Frenchmen and women only if you are not Basque, if you are not Breton, if you don't use this kind of what was considered inferior language. One of the famous quotes from this period is, how revolutionaries defined their enemies, and they defined them all in cultural terms, in terms of their diversity. And the quote is: "Federalism and superstition speak Breton, migration and the hatred of the Republic speak German, counter-revolution speaks Italian, and fanaticism speaks Basque." So these are the enemies, and our enemies are all culturally defined, which is interesting. American revolutionaries did, have a similar, kind of strategy, if you like. They combined these Enlightenment ideas, that the French used as well, and have managed to, build a state very much using these universalist principles while excluding others, including obviously Native Americans, and maintaining slavery and kind of including African Americans and everything else. And a lot of this, what has happened in terms of creating this nation state, happened through violence, obviously through war against the native populations, then War of 1812, then Mexican-American War, and later on Spanish-American War. So a lot of this was done through violence, through conflict, and U.S. state was created through kind of that coercive attack on cultural difference. Despite kind of always having that difference present, it was an assimilation state, not very different in many respects from the French idea of assimilationism, just operating in a very different context. And if you still look at the French context, this is a start, the culturally different. If you look at the map, from where France started and then where it ended at, let's say, in the early 20th century, it became much more homogenized because of all these coercive practices that were used. And even in 1925, we find quotes such as from Minister of Public Education France, Anatole de Mons, who said, "For the linguistic unity of France, the Breton language must disappear." So it's a very open and clear attack on any form of cultural difference. And we see similar things throughout the European continent. We see that, expulsion of Muslim population in the Balkans, particularly after the weakening and collapse of Ottoman Empire and First and Second Balkan Wars. We see also that kind of attack on Muslim religion in Caucasus, and then obviously genocides, Holocaust. Mark Mazower's book describes this really well and calls Europe the Dark Continent with a reason. And elements of that were very much present in North America with, legislation that was brought to remove native population, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and 1862, the Homestead Act, which were essentially acts of ethnic cleansing. So there was a very clear, obvious attack on diversity. So what's important for us to emphasize here is that, there are a lot of similarities between these 19th and early 20th century attacks on cultural diversity in the name of creating homogeneous nation states to today, what's happening today. So today we have again attack on cultural diversity. In the 19th century, the principal targets were the nationally ambiguous peasantry, speakers of local vernaculars like Breton and Basque and others, and indigenous population in the context of, let's say, US. Today, the focus is on immigrant populations. So they are seen more or less along the same lines as disturbing, this national homogeneity, supposed national homogeneity. So there's an element of paradox here present that nationalism loads cultural difference, but it could not exist without it because it needs it. This kind of nation state is a homogenizing machine that needs this it feeds itself off on cultural diversity, on kind of attacking cultural diversity. So it needs always something. Before it was peasants who were not Frenchmen yet. Today it's immigrant populations, and so that's in that sense always present. So if you look at the this is not the best image, but what it's trying to show is a result of the different surveys on feeling proud in being member of a particular nation. And what we see is green here. Green is being very proud, and the light green is being quite proud. So most of these, this is across the world, starting with Qatar, Ghana, Ecuador, Uzbekistan. So what we see is a really very high sense of attachment to nation states in the world today. And if we look at a variety of different surveys, you get that this has been increasing steadily since 1960s. Eurobarometer surveys show that as well in Europe, despite the kind of European project and everything else, that nationhood is a very powerful and more present and more embedded in that sense of how people see themselves. So if you think of nationalism, we don't have to think only about something like this, the kind of aggressive expressions of nationalism that are present in officially in some states. Nationalism obviously is more also like this, something everyday banal, and there's a lot of research on that done by scholars of everyday nationalism, and also something like this, which is something that we are now more used to thinking about, as the far right movements. And so far right is obviously an enemy of cultural diversity by definition. They say that openly, and But the main point for us is that this is only a small kind of segment of historical experience of nationalism. So nationalism is not, something that only far right is dealing with, all nation states are enemies of diversity in one way or another. So this is not about individuals, about small groups, about some far right parties. This is a structural phenomenon, because nationalism is built on that idea that somebody has to be excluded. So it is about structural logic. There is this organizational ideological grounding that generates exclusion, because an all-inclusive nationalism doesn't make any sense. It's not sociologically realistic. Why would you then need nationality as a foundation of a state in the first place? So somebody always has to be excluded. That's the problem with nationalism. And people who try to develop argument for multicultural nationalism, such as Tariq Madood and Ephraim Nimni, other, really cannot deal with this sociological reality, because somebody is always excluded. That's the nature of nationalism. Otherwise, why would you have a nationalism? So just to conclude, essentially, the key issue for nationalism is that we cannot look at it as some sort of temporary aberration, as some exception that happens only suddenly out of nowhere. So it's not an exception. Nationalism is the norm. It has been the norm for the last 200 years, and it's become much more embedded more recently. Okay, so I will stop here, and then we will have time now for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Sinisa, for rather provocative, sometimes in many aspects, statement. We actually have loads of questions already. I'm going to take, if I may just, we're going to take questions as they appeared here. There are two options. You can either raise your hand and use voicing and microphone to ask your question, or you can write your question in the chat box. I think that Kat actually asked her about, well, these are the issues of sources. That I'm going to pass that for the now. Lara asked first question, would nationalism be a product, a reaction to imperialism, a reaction to colonizers? And US was formed against, and us was formed against they, the enemy. Do you want to take this first?
Why don't we just have a few questions, and then I'll respond.
Chris is next. Chris, do you want to use your microphone?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk, and something I'm very interested in, although not to the same extent that I haven't researched to the same extent you have. Two questions really, and somebody just popped up in the chat box about the link between nationalism and patriotism. One of the issues that we see the current nationalist Tory party in the UK using, one of the slurs they've used against Labour, is that Labour and the opposition, the left wing, are not patriotic, and of course not helped by the fact that the previous Labour leader refused to sing the national anthem, and it caused a great big scandal in the right-wing press. The current leader, Keir Starmer, has been very careful to say that he and the Labour Party under his management are patriotic, but it just somehow doesn't ring true. And I just wonder what the left can do to fight against this charge that the right uses against them, that they're not patriotic. And secondly, this idea of sort of cultural, the sort of cultural dominance of one group in a nation state. Clearly there's been mass immigration into the United Kingdom in particular, and France and Germany as well, since the Second World War. And I just wondered, what does that do to this idea that a nation is built around a particular identity that creates it? Because as time goes on, in all of those three European democracies, the society is becoming more diverse and more multicultural. And I just wondered what your views were on where that is all headed. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sintra. Do you want one more?
Maybe one more, yeah.
Svetlana asks about, she said, you mentioned the role of institutions of public shaming in nationalization. Could you please say more about this?
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. So the first question was about the relationship between imperialism and nationalism. And I mentioned, that in the 19th century, we really have this as a kind of interdependent process because states, particularly states that have overseas empires, they were nationalizing at home, creating these new institutions and new educational system in place, in mass media to nationalize population, which was still very much strongly identifying locally and religiously and kinship-based and things like that, while at the same time, having this large-scale imperial project. However, the consequences of this kind of paradoxical relationship was that they also introduced a lot of these nationalist kind of ideas in the colonies that they colonized, they control. So the consequence of decolonization was creation of nation states, often on the borders that were created by the imperial powers. So we have that in the legacies of that are still very much present throughout Africa and Asia. So imperialism was very much integral part to this, into nationalism. And kind of older scholarship tended to have a clearly, a differentiated view that imperialism and nationalism are mutually exclusive. But what we know now more is there's more similarity, more continuity than previously taught. There are obviously some profound differences, but nationalism did emerge out of the existing imperial structures that were in place. So this is a big topic. I cannot go into details here, but yeah, there is that link very much present. Okay, the second. So Chris asked 2 points. One about the role of the left and kind of the political. The nationalism is very malleable ideology, and it has been historically able to capture a political left, political right, and anything in between. If you look at the kind of immediately after the French Revolution and throughout the early 19th century, it was a fairly left-wing ideology, very much anti-imperial, anti-feudal. It was about incorporating different social strata. But by the end of the 19th century, it became much more right-wing, linked with imperialism, linked with racism, and then shifted again in the 50s and 60s as a decolonial project, anti-imperial again, and things like that. So in a sense, there is a room, obviously, for nationalism to be left as well as right-wing. And we do have examples of that. A lot of kind of state socialist countries were also nationalists at the same time. But if we move into what, the British context that you're referring to, yeah, right has always seen itself as dominating that area, in that terrain, but that's not inevitable. And I think there is a way to articulate that for strategic reasons, political reasons, not kind of genuine reasons, not reasons of exclusion. And I think that's important. I think it's impossible to attain a large-scale support without invoking some of this discourse. I mean, that's often referred to as a patriotism, although in social sciences we don't like that term. It doesn't really mean anything. Nationalism is a nationalism. Often we use that term patriotism. We are patriots, our enemies are nationalists, but it's the same sociological phenomenon. I mean, you can use term whichever you like. It's still the same phenomenon. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a room, and left has to play with its own cards, if you like. And that's possible to develop kind of a welfare inclusive version of it. But there is always that problem of how do you deal with diversity, because somebody's always excluded. That's my point. I'm a little bit more pessimistic in that sense of, whenever you invoke this kind of nationalist discourses, somebody is excluded. And that's a problem. It's easier for right to do that because right always does that anyway. Yeah, and that's linked in a way to the third question that you raised about the dominance of a particular group. Yeah, that's the thing. In a sense, that's what I said. It's impossible to have this fully multicultural nationalism that some people advocate, because you have states like Canada, like Bolivia, like Peru. They're officially multicultural states, and they do accept all kinds of diversities, and they're institutionalized as such. But there are always groups that are excluded. There are always groups that are marginalized. In Canada, it's something recently, native population were completely excluded, even though Canada multicultural for a long time. And we said that in Bolivia as well, the majority population was excluded until fairly recently, and is still excluded in economic respect. So that's a problem. How do you, I mean, this is more a normative question, and I'm a sociologist. I'm really more interested in why things happen the way they do. But it's a difficult project to deal with. And the last one was about institutions of nationalism and public shaming. So public shaming is something that civil society can do, and the states can do as well. And one form of public shaming is, let's say, during the war, if people are not supportive enough and you're not willing to volunteer and fight or support the war cause, you're deemed, what Chris was saying already, as not being patriotic enough. So that's a form of public shaming. You're shamed in front of your close family members and people where you live. And that's nationalist discourse always does that. It is about treason. It is about us. You work for somebody else. And in times of crisis, you can use these forms. And that was very much, with the Dreyfus affair, that was an important element. How institutions, French institutions, both the state and the civil society, used that discourse of public shaming, and who was loyal, who was linked with the state, and who was the supporting enemy. So these are important elements. Have always played an important part in nationalism.
Thank you very much. We have quite a few more questions. I think Digby's question is very much linked to what you already said. He's questioning the whole nature of multiculturalism, but asks about the UK, whether UK can be seen, I guess, as a society that protects cultural minorities or not. That's one question. I think Marco has another, but he will ask, I guess, a voice. Marco, do you want to voice? We can't hear you, Marco. In the meantime,
you hear me now? Sorry.
That's much better. Please, yes.
Sorry, the video is not working for some time.
That's
Anyhow,
okay.
Thank you, Sinisha. Yeah, I think I would like to go back to the same point that I guess is interesting, how many people here in this chat actually keep going back to this idea of the multicultural nation. And for me, the major concern to go back to this point is just what I call the demographic change. So if you look at the demographic projection, basically at the end of the century, the white majority, there is the titular group that is basically putting forward this white nationalism, so exclusive, so xenophobic. Basically, that white majority will become the minority. So if this is taken, it has to be taken seriously. Obviously, the question is how, what kind of alternative nation, if there is an alternative nation, people with a different ethnic background, but still member of the nation, might be putting forward. So I do believe there is more nation beyond the nationalist nation, which is usually the monopoly of the white ethnic core. And I do think that more research has to be done to that form of, for my research, what I see, there's a more open relational nation. We cannot avoid the moment of closure, but this is part of any polity. At a certain point, you will draw a boundary. This is unavoidable. But yeah, I think there is something more there. Yeah, I will stop here. It's a long video, but I will stop.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so will I respond then to these two questions, because they are linked. They're both about kind of culturalism, and I think it's I mean, what Marco is saying, I mean, it's right in a sense. Nationalism changes. It has always been changing from the very beginning. So it's not a particular uniform expression that we have. And I said politically has changed from left to left to right, in anything in between. And he was able also to incorporate some groups. If you look at the US nationalism from the 19th century, it was very much WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Over the years, it included some groups. It included religiously other, like Catholics and Jews. And it accommodated a kind of white version of nationalism, but it still excluded other groups. It excluded African Americans, it included Native Americans, and Asians, and others. So in that sense, nationalism has room for accommodating some groups, but it's always at the expense of somebody else. So you might be right, Marco, in a sense that these nationalism, European nationalisms, maybe Italian and others, can accommodate some groups, but somebody is always excluded. And I think that's the nature of nationalist project. It doesn't have to be racist. It doesn't have to be ethnically defined. It could be a civic nationalism. It could be more inclusive of different groups, but it's still puts limits. Limits are the borders and boundaries of nationhood. Who is the citizen? Who has the full rights? Who you identify with? And that's the nature of nation state. Nation state is limited, and it has only it's built around that notion of nationhood. You can change the character of nationhood, but you cannot get rid of nationhood as a concept, because this legitimizes the nation state as such. Otherwise, why would you need the nation state in the first place? You could have empires which were very culturally diverse, but also very hierarchical. You could have patrimonial kingdoms and anything in between. So my point is really there is this sociological reason why nationalism is always attacking diversity. It doesn't have to attack all forms of diversity. It doesn't have to, it can be very civic and very exclusive, but there has always to be other of some sort. And that's the point. And, so he says, I'm personally very much in favor of cultural diversity and multiculturalism, but I think sociologically it's important to see, where these limits are coming from. And the institution of the nation state is the one that generates that.
Thank you very much. We have a kind of, I think, a conceptual issues here. Kentau asked about difference between nationalism and patriotism, and Digby earlier was asking about differences between nationalism and jingoism, though you did cover some in your talk later on. And if you want, Nicholas here is talking about a liberal nationalism as proposed, advocated by or described by Yale Tamir, and he asks, does it really differ from what we now have in most countries in the West as the mainstream norm? To which extent can it deal with diversity?
Okay.
Yeah, I think for now.
These are good points. Yeah, I mean, the patriotism, nationalism, as I said, so conventionally, this is always used, as we are patriots and we are loyal, and nationalists are the others. And you could say historically there was patriotism was an older concept. It goes all the way back to the Roman Republic. Patria is republic, so defender of the republic, somebody who is loyal to the republic, and that was very much an elite concept. It wasn't really senators. Nobody cared about the rest of the population, and the rest of the population didn't identify with in that same way. So after the French American revolutions, after the kind of nationalizing, mass nationalizing experiences, a nation is the only dominant form of organization. So patriotism is nationalism in a sense, because we live in the world of nation states. You're loyal to nation states. You're not loyal to an empire. You're not loyal to a chiefdom. You're not loyal to sultanate or whatever. So in that sense, they are the same, sociologically speaking. They're the same, even though people might like to differentiate them, and because patriotism sounds nice, but it's it's like gravity. You can call it bed of roses, whatever. It's the same phenomenon. It pulls. Too much gravity can kill you. Too little gravity can kill you. The right amount we need to live. So that's the same with the categories, with the terms that we use. I don't use patriotism in that sense, because it's meaningless in modernity, because this is all nationalism, just different forms of it. I think this debate about liberal nationalism, I'm very skeptical of this. I mean, I'm familiar very much with Tamil's. I remember reading her first book on liberal nationalism, which was much better than the one that was recently published. And Miller, David Miller, they're the key representatives of the liberal nationalism tradition. So this is more like political theory. They're developing case for that. Nationalism is necessary. There is no kind of welfare state outside of nationalism and things like that. I'm fairly skeptical of these types of arguments. They're deeply normative, and they are fairly essentialist in the sense they're not sociological. They don't really dissect that. They think that nationalism can deal with difference. I don't think it can ultimately. I've been critical fairly of both of these perspectives of Tamil and Miller. But that's a problem, because they do come from political theory. So their arguments are normative, not historically sociological in the sense of looking at the reality, how it works. You can develop a form of more nationalism that is more liberal or less liberal, or more conservative or less conservative, more socialist or less socialist, but it's still nationalism, and it still has that problem with diversity, dealing with diversity.
Thank you very much. We have an interesting comment from Chris. It's a little bit more closer to our home here. He says Helen von Bismarck has an interesting take on the nationalist strategy of the current UK Tory government. Her take is that Johnson's nationalism is not an ideology, but rather a political method. That's one. And then we have from Kat a question and comment. She said, states positioning themselves as diverse and championing diversity are doing so in opposition to an other as well, aren't they? Look at us, we are the progressive West, we are more forward-looking than XYZ region. It is a form of self-promotion and legitimization, isn't it? And in the end, also mostly not more than empty rhetoric, as 2020 large-scale spread of Black Lives Matter shows. There is also Kathy Sullivan. She says, must nationalism always be equated with nation-state structure? Thinking of you sanguine, you solely. Do you want to address any of these questions?
Yeah, okay. I'll try to group them together. I mean, I might start from the last point about nation state and nationalism. So obviously, you know, there are different forms of nationalism. Nationalism that is promoted by the state and authorities of the state is different from nationalism that is developed within civil society, which could include, let's say, minority nationalisms and nationalisms that challenge the state and things like that, and they range from right to left. So in that sense, nationalism doesn't have to be a state project, but it always appears in the context of nation state as a form. That's the, you know, you don't have to, you know, you could have, you know, you have Kurdish nationalism, you have Basque nationalism, you have Catalan nationalism. So these are not state nationalisms. They attack the existing state, but they advocate establishment of a particular state themselves. Nationalism can be also cultural, doesn't have to be political, but it still operates and it develops through the institutions of nation states. So it's not possible to kind of, you know, the whole idea of cultural nationalism works in the context of nation states that we have in the world today. We have no other form of state today. Even the kind of city states have now been reframed as nation states, like, you know, Singapore and Monaco, and even though they are not, you know, proper nation states in that sense. But that's the thing, because nation state is now considered to be only a legitimate form of political authority. So you can develop nationalisms which are not necessarily state-seeking or state-reaffirming. They could be cultural or economic or something else. But as long as we operate in the world of nation state, it's impossible to be completely detached from the nation state as a structure, because the nation state as a structure generates that. You know, you can go in favor of respective nation state or against it, but still in the world of nation states. Okay, the second point was about British, in the British context of, yeah, I mean, I'm not, you're more familiar than I am with the British case. I know obviously Tory has that policy of one nation nationalism, which is nominally used, but not necessarily in reality in any way. You could say, I mean, individual politicians might use nationalist, and they have always used nationalist discourse for their own purposes, political purposes, and it could be also means of manipulation, as it always works. But there is, you know, always some kind of ideological discourse around which they have to work, and they have to fight and frame their political acts. So even Johnson might not have a very developed nationalist discourse, and obviously Trump has even less developed. But, you know, they do articulate some kind of version of nationalism, which, you know, it has to work within the established parameters of their own political system, their own political parties. So within the Tory party, you have to develop, you know, to build on already existing ideas of what nation is, what Britishness represents, and I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about self-promotion of the West. Yes, I mean, that's, I think there is always that sense of, you know, why new nationalism was used as a concept. It was used precisely to say that, you know, we expect that nationalism happens in other places of the world. It's in the Balkans, it's, you know, in Eastern Europe, it's in somewhere in Asia, but it doesn't happen in America, it doesn't happen in Britain, and that's why this is seen as a surprise. And in these images that I presented with from Economist show exactly that, you know, that sense of shock. Why is this happening here? Why are we going back to the 19th century? But that's the thing. It has always been happening here. It's happening everywhere, all over the world. But so that's kind of, you know, perception of the West as being exceptional and unique. it's not exceptional, it's not unique. This is a worldwide phenomenon and has been developing over the last few centuries.
Thank you. And I think it's going to be now last set of questions. Barbara has a question about France and French language policy. She says, interesting is also the explanation why the French started imposing a national language on cultural minorities in the 19th century, because it was assumed that it is only through the high French language that the ideas of the French Revolution, freedom, equality, and brotherhood, can be assumed by the people. What is your opinion of that?
Mm-hmm.
Would you want to address this, or? Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I think that was one way to legitimize this idea that you cannot understand the idea of an Enlightenment project and the idea of the French state, which promises liberty, equality, and fraternity to all, unless you are full citizen, participating citizen of this new republic. And to do that, you have to be a French speaker, so Frenchness is defined by this high level French language. So I think revolutionaries and many French governments have since used the same type of legitimacy. That to be included, to be part of our society, we all have to be alike in that sense. But that's obviously a problematic way of understanding and dealing with cultural difference, because anything that doesn't fit into this kind of homogenized understanding, assimilated concept of Frenchness is seen as a problem, as a threat to the French state. And I identify that quote, how everybody else was defined in cultural terms as a threat to, minority languages are a threat, religious people are a threat, German speakers are a threat. So that is a problem, and and it shows exactly how nationalism has a problem with diversity. Sometimes it's very explicit, as it is in French case. In other cases, maybe it's less explicit, but it's still there.
Okay, and then definitely last question, and I think kind of, I don't know, maybe to end or either positive or a little bit pessimistic note, depends on you. Peter asked, in your opinion, can or should we go beyond nationalism? Should this be the major project in a globalized and diverse world?
Okay, so this is a big question, and it's also, kind of questions probably for all of us, and it's a normative question. So in a sense, there isn't much I can do. I can say yes, but that won't make a difference. What's more interesting, I think, for us is like now we have a lot of recent debates on kind of decolonization of curriculum and kind of on incorporation of different cultural traditions and recognition of difference, but we don't really. There is no a project on denationalizing the world at all. We've kind of assumed that national categories are normal and naturalized, and they shouldn't be. So we do question this. We say, okay, there is a lack of diversity here. We do accept diversity, but we always accept it within the national categories. That's the problem. We keep reproducing this. I haven't seen much criticism really of national categories at all. And that's the problem. We tend to focus only on a kind of aggressive versions of nationalism, on these kind of far right discourses, but we don't really focus on everyday forms of nationalism, on kind of banal nationalism, on the way how all of this is reproduced, and the understanding that we have to be members of a particular nation state is not questioned. That's more of a problem. So it's hard to see how we can go beyond that as long as we have a nation states, and this is where power resides.
Excellent point. Thank you very much. There are a few questions also from Maya and Nicholas, and there are some comments, and I'm quite sure that Sinisha will be happy to send or to receive emails and exchange any kind of debate, but I think we exhausted him enough for now. I was just thinking, listening to this, how nationalism, sorry for this, but nationalism is like toilets, like everybody has it, but nobody dares to discuss it publicly, right? It's like something that we don't like to address. Thank you very much, Sinisha, for very thought-provoking speech and your comments. Thank you, all of you, for being here. and for your questions. Maria wants to say a few words at the end, but thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much as well.
Thank you, Sinisha. That's been a very inspiring and interesting talk. I always say the same, but I couldn't stop taking notes. I love the idea of this exclusion-inclusion. Sometimes we need to define, we know who we are by excluding others, but knowing who we are not. You know, I'm thinking now about Catalans and Basque country in Spain, where I'm from, etc. So I found this extremely interesting. And I want to thank you. We are very grateful in the Centre for having you here today and for dealing and be so patient with the technicalities, etc. Thank you, Gordana, for bringing Sinisha to us today and let us address such an interesting topic. Okay, so this is the last event we've got in this centre until Christmas. Of course, we'll come back with new events at the beginning of 2021. It's been a wonderful semester for us, and we just, in my name and in name of Luis Ryan, we just want to say thank you to all of you for attending, for many names that I've seen in many of the events that we've organised, and we hope to see you all next year. Keep an eye on the website, please, because we'll update it very soon with a new event coming up, and have a lovely Christmas break, all of you, and we hope to see you very soon in the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre. Thank you so much to all of you. We'll see you very soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you again.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.